This is Origin Stories, the Leakey Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. You've probably done something nice for someone else today without even thinking about it.
I think we've all had the experience of people, strangers, stepping up to help us when they didn't need to. You know, from holding a door to jumping out of their car when you've had a car accident to see what they could do to, bringing back your dog that's gotten lost. We've all had that experience.
We do these kinds of things, sometimes at great cost or even great risk to ourselves. Why? Our species' strong tendency towards helping others has been a puzzle to scientists since Darwin. He first considered our self-sacrificing ways in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, where he wrote about it in problematic Victorian language, saying, quote, "He who is ready to sacrifice his life, as many a savage has been, would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature." Darwin worried that altruism was the one weird behavior that might mess up the whole idea of natural selection. After all, if natural selection is about surviving to reproduce and making sure your own genes are carried on, why would people ever do things like rush into a burning building to save a stranger? Or on a more day-to-day level, why would we give money to charity or give up food that could go to ourselves or our own kids? Why would natural selection favor behaviors that seem to make us less likely to survive? It's a big question for biologists.
When biologists use the term altruism, they mean very specifically behaviors that are costly to the individual who performs the behavior and beneficial to the individual who is the recipient of the behavior. So if I have a pizza and I give you half my pizza, that's costly to me because I've now given up half my pizza, but beneficial to you because you now have half a pizza.
This is Joan Silk. She's a primatologist at Arizona State University and a member of the Leakey Foundation's Scientific Executive Committee. She's been studying primate social behavior and considering the question of altruism for a long time.
The human capacity for altruism is special in a couple of ways. First of all, in human societies, cooperation plays a much bigger role than it does in even our closest relatives, like chimpanzees. If you ask somebody who studies chimps to list all the ways in which chimpanzees cooperate, they'll give you a list. They groom one another, they go on boundary patrols together, they share meat. Sometimes they form coalitions, but the list is not going to be a lot longer than that.
If you ask someone who studies people that live in small-scale societies,
people that have studied, say, the Ache or the Kung, they'll have a list that goes on and on and on. So the ways and the context in which people cooperate is much greater than that of other closely related primates. So human societies rely on cooperation to a much larger extent, and people also cooperate with a wider range of partners.
Those partners include our family, our friends, our work colleagues, even strangers, and people online from places we may never visit.
So the range of individuals with whom we cooperate is much greater than in any other primates or any other animals, really.
Joan Silk says that when she talks about cooperation, she's thinking about it in terms of altruism, where the cooperation involves a cost to someone and a benefit to someone else.
And for biologists, who pays the cost is really important because it helps us understand how it might have evolved. Because if it involves a cost to the actor, there's a problem from the point of view of natural selection.
Which brings us back to Darwin and our question, how could altruistic behavior have evolved? And how has it shaped the way we are today?
So a lot of people think that cooperation, altruistic cooperation, has played a critical role in the evolution of modern human behavior and lifestyles. It ranges from how we raise our kids to how we make a living, to how we organize our societies into large communities. In terms of how we raise our kids, women don't raise their kids alone the way most other primate mothers do. So a chimpanzee female has one child every 6 years or so. she provides everything that infant needs until it's weaned. Women who are raising children in small-scale human societies rely on help from others to raise their kids.
Women produce fewer calories than they and their children need, and the deficit is made up by their partners, their mothers, and by other members of the community. They all help feed the kids.
So in terms of raising kids, people have made the argument that we can't do it on our own. And the only way we can raise human children, which are very costly to rear because they're dependent for a really long period of time, is by getting help from other members of our communities.
Silk says scientists have also made the argument that without altruism, without sharing, hunting as a primary means of subsistence isn't really practical.
So men go out to hunt. It's mainly men in most places in the world. They go out to hunt, and their chances of finding something, of making a kill on a given day, are relatively low. So you go out to hunt on one day, you don't find anything. You might go out to the hunt the next day, you don't find anything. You go out and hunt 3 days, you might not find anything. And after a while, if you don't find anything, you starve to death. And hunting is sufficiently unpredictable that if people couldn't count on sharing food, they wouldn't be able to survive as hunters.
There's a huge difference between coming back to a camp where it's every person for themselves and a camp where your community pools resources.
So if somebody else has made a kill, then the way it works in most foraging societies is that meat is shared around. So by sharing, you can offset the risks that any individual faces from the low success rate of hunting activities.
So these are some hypotheses. It's harder, though, to make concrete connections between things like subsistence hunting, our cooperative breeding, and our modern human tendency towards cooperation and altruism.
Well, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. If you need cooperation to have to sustain these kinds of life histories and subsistence patterns, then how do you get the life history patterns and subsistence patterns before you get the cooperation? And we haven't fully resolved that question, how we got to the place where we can cooperate. But it's really clear that humans are all set up to cooperate a lot.
There's been fossil evidence that can get at aspects of these questions, especially the question of when altruistic behavior might have started to increase in humans.
We don't exactly know how the capacity for cooperation evolved, and we don't know exactly when. But we think it probably didn't happen until a couple 100,000 years ago. And it probably didn't happen until children started to have this very long, slow development.
Silk says if you look back at Homo erectus, which is an extinct species of early human that lived between about 1.89 million and 143,000 years ago, you see something pretty interesting. Studies of fossil Homo erectus teeth suggest that Homo erectus kids didn't grow up slowly like modern humans do.
It looks like they grew up fairly quickly, like chimp kids do. But later on, that changes, and we get this slow development. And that's when it probably was very important that we were able to create a support structure that would allow for this long period of development. That long period of development is probably one of the things that created a lot of pressure for more cooperative groups. The other element that gets brought into the story somehow is that we became more and more dependent on culture. We became more and more dependent on learning things from one another and from things like technology.
As technology became more complicated, as we moved beyond simple stone tools, it became beneficial for our ancestors to be able to learn from other people, not just by trial and error.
Evolutionary pressures that favor the development of cultural learning may also have created some novel evolutionary forces that facilitated the evolution of group-level cooperation, cooperating with members of the group, thinking about the benefits to the group as a whole.
This kind of altruistic cooperation is really different than the cooperation in our primate relatives.
So baboons, I study baboons, and I have watched many, many, many grooming bouts. A lot of those grooming bouts are directed to close relatives, and baboons tend to reciprocate. If I groom you a lot, you groom me a lot. So the difference between humans and other primates is that we are much more likely to cooperate with unrelated individuals and with individuals that we don't have these long-term reciprocal relationships with. And we cooperate in a much wider range of contexts.
Silk says we've also evolved what she calls social preferences, a taste for cooperation, a taste for altruism.
There's a quote from Abraham Lincoln when he said, "I feel good when I do good." And I think that a lot of people share that actually feels good because you care about what happens to other people. And I think one of the interesting things about modern times in human societies is that we've increasingly expanded the boundaries of our social concern. It's a good thing to remember that although we live in dark and scary times, that we're actually, as primates go, pretty nice. We don't always use our capacity for cooperation in peaceful or nice ways, but we have these capacities, and they can be channeled into productive, helpful, charitable, generous, just acts. And I think that's cheering to know that we begin with an animal that's pretty well set up for being nice. I think that's a pretty positive message, and I think it's actually true.
So the next time you hold the door for a stranger or donate to charity, consider that these are the things that have allowed us to thrive as a species. Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation. Support for this episode came from the Being Human Initiative and the Bauman Foundation. And after a short message from the Leakey Foundation, we'll have our Being Human bonus segment, so keep listening. Does all this talk about kindness make you feel like helping out? The Leakey Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding human origins research and outreach, and we could use your help. You can support this show and the science we talk about with a tax-deductible donation to the Leakey Foundation. And thanks to an anonymous, altruistic donor, your donation will be doubled. Your $10 will become $20. Visit leakeyfoundation.org/donate. That's LEAKEY foundation.org. As I was talking with Dr. Silk about altruistic behavior for this episode, I couldn't help but think about another podcast that's all about altruism. It's called Kind World, produced by WBUR in Boston. Their show is about both everyday and sometimes extreme acts of human kindness. It's really good, and in the spirit of altruism, they're happy to share a story with you for our Being Human bonus segment. It might shed a different kind of light on what it means to be altruistic.
Welcome to Kind World from WBUR Boston. I'm Erika Lantz. Today we have a story of a remarkable friendship and an act of kindness from an unexpected source.
I have to take off my shoe and I prick myself and blood comes out. It's my blood sugar tester. Sometimes it's kind of like annoying when kids just stare because they just don't know what it's about.
That's Jonah Pournazarian. His classmates don't fully understand the liver disease he has that could be fatal. But Jonah's friend, Dylan Siegel, responds differently.
Dylan, he doesn't really stare. He just talks to me, and we just laugh together, and it's really fun.
Dylan is 9 years old now, but this story starts 3 years ago when the boys were in first grade. Dylan's mom, Deborah Siegel, was driving her son home from Jonah's house when she told him that Jonah had a rare condition he could die from. She explained there was no cure, and doctors needed money to find one.
I'm like, oh my God, I want to help.
And I said, great, I love that. Do you want to do a bake sale? Do you want to do a lemonade stand? He's like, no. He looked at me like I was insane. What horrible ideas. Later that night, I was putting him to bed, and he said, I thought about what I want to do for Jonah.
I'm like, how about I could write a book?
The next day, Dylan took out his markers and wrote a storybook he dedicated to Jonah. He called it Chocolate Bar.
Chocolate bar means awesome.
Each page listed something chocolate bar, like Disneyland or going swimming. Dylan's plan? Sell his book to raise money for research. But first, he needed some parental help.
He marched in my office and said, "Here's my book. Will you go make copies?"
Please, 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 print it. And they're like, oh, okay, I'll do it later, blah, blah, blah. A week before our special school event, I was like, can I please sell it at our school event? And Mom was like, oh my God, I haven't printed it yet. So I went to Dad, I'm like, Dad, print it, fast. And I'm like, I want chocolate bars too. And he's like, oh my God. So he called Whole Foods, and they said they'd give us 100 chocolate bars for free. I sat behind a table. We sold our books and our chocolate bars, and we sold out.
The next week, Dylan spoke at a PTA meeting.
Somebody asked him, how much money you want to raise?
$1 million.
And I was like, what? What did he just say? Does he even know what $1 million is? I mean, he's 6 years old.
I even thought I was a little crazy. But then I'm like, wait, I could do anything I want. I could cure this disease.
Curing a disease is a daunting proposition for anyone, but a 6-year-old? And unfortunately, this particular disease posed a major challenge. Dr. David Weinstein of the University of Florida says Jonah's type of GSD, or glycogen storage disease, is 1 in a million, so rare that it's often not taught in medical school. Weinstein is one of the few doctors who treat and research GSD.
There's no funding. Honestly, I've come close to giving up numerous times.
But Dylan had made up his mind. Many doctors may not be familiar with GSD, but Dylan learned as much as he could.
He has no white blood cells at all, or very, very low. So whenever he catches something like a cold, he could end up in the hospital. He has to drink cornstarch every couple of hours to keep his blood sugar high.
Yep, cornstarch every 3 hours, even at night.
We set 3 alarms.
That's Jonah's mom, Laura.
If we miss a feeding, he can have seizures, go into a coma, and die.
They've had close calls, watching Jonah be rushed to the emergency room by paramedics who weren't sure they could save him. That fragility motivated Jonah's friend Dylan. He took every opportunity to approach people with his book. One of them happened to work in the news media and picked up the story.
A 6-year-old who decided he could make a change in the world.
People told their friends told their friends told more friends.
And dollars started flowing into the fund for Dr. Weinstein's research.
The next milestone I remember was hitting 25,000. I thought that was incredible.
You can make a difference.
I love Jonah so.
And then it went to 50,000.
So much.
I got interviewed by Chelsea Clinton,
Good Morning America, and
Diane Sawyer.
being on nightly news.
The book so many of you bought for a good cause.
Copies shipped to all 50 states and 56 countries from Australia to Denmark.
I don't think any of us could have imagined
Except
something
for Dylan.
like this.
Dylan's the only one that had this in his imagination.
In the middle of all of this, Dylan's family heard from the mother of a boy in the hospital with the same disease as Jonah.
When we went into the boys' room in the ICU, there was a copy of Dylan's book on his bed. And the mom told us how much Dylan's book had meant to him and that he had 3 copies of Dylan's book and that he was so inspired by Dylan. Here was a kid who was fighting for his life and a mom who had spent her last 13 years trying to keep him alive. About a week later, he passed away. And it was really hard.
After that death, both families threw themselves into reaching Dylan's $1 million goal.
My parents and Jonah's parents worked their butt off. I knew that it was going to happen. My instincts told me.
And he was right.
Now we have over $1 million.
Dr. Weinstein is now planning human trials for GSD gene therapy for next year, and he says his team has found treatments for mice with Jonah's rare subtype.
I'm still in shock. We are on the verge of curing or treating this disease, and that would not have been possible if the 6-year-old boy hadn't created this book.
Dylan may make a difference in the lives of some very sick children, but there's something else he and Jonah are looking forward to.
Well, And I never have a sleepover at like someone else's house. Once I get cured, Dylan and I made plans to have a huge slumber party and just have fun. Play games, watch TV, just us two.
Thanks to Erika, Lantz, and WBUR's Kind World. You can find their show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Go subscribe now and listen to their new season of stories. Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation. Support for this episode comes from the Being Human Initiative and the Bauman Foundation, dedicated to understanding modern life from an evolutionary perspective. Thanks to Joan Silk for sharing her work. Our editor is Julia Barton. We had help on this episode from Susan Valot. Our theme music is by Henry Nagel. Additional music credits are in the show notes. Transcripts are provided by the kind people at Adept Word Management. Intelligent transcripts. Please check them out for all your transcription needs at adeptwordmanagement.com. Thanks for listening.